I have a confession. I have never seen Antz. Well, I have now, but I hadn't for my entire childhood. Now, I had seen A Bug's Life, and also confession, I actually like this movie. Like, I really like watching it in a guilty pleasure type of way. I have no desire to defend this movie as a piece of art because it's actually quite bad. Like, for a Pixar film, it's really nothing special. If it were made by any other studio, we probably would have forgotten about it completely. I most likely just enjoy it in any regard because of nostalgia. But then I watched Ants, and yeah, I'm sorry. I know some people like this movie, but it is in fact odd. Weird. Strange, even. Also, I didn't like it. I thought it was bad, but I could not possibly blame anyone for liking it because look at the trash that I watch for fun.
Founder is facing up to 20 years in prison.
If you had thousands of dollars to go on a trip to see Blink 182, that's on you. That is Darwinism at its finest.
This is not meant to be a review though, so if you love this movie, feel no need to defend its honor in the comments. Or do, because I would for sure be interested in what people like about this movie, or liked about it as kids. I just want to revisit this movie, or in my case, really visit it for the first time, and explore its implications about society. I actually knew pretty much nothing about the plot and just thought, this seems like a fitting example of an early computer animated movie that can be mined for content, and well, unlike when I watched Robots, which immediately grabbed me with a clear message that I really appreciated, or A Bug's Life, which I don't think really has anything meaningful to say at all, Ants just has a lot of thoughts, and it made me have a lot of thoughts. Thoughts about what it means to be an individual in a society full of individuals, what it means to have a duty to your fellow man, whether it is possible to act both in your own self-interest and the interest of a collective at the same time, and who made the decision to put Woody Allen in a movie made for children in 1998. And I figured it would have been a waste of the time I spent watching the movie to not try to organize those thoughts together in some kind of cohesive thesis.
Hello, I'm Michael Eisner.
It's impossible to talk about Ants without comparing it to A Bug's Life given the intertwined destinies of the two movies. If you don't know the story, I guess this will be the first mention of Michael Eisner or Jeffrey Katzenberg on this channel. To make a very long story short, Jeffrey Katzenberg was head of Walt Disney Studios, placing him in charge of all feature film releases, including animated films from 1984 to 1994. At this point, he was pressured into resigning from Disney after years of tensions between him, the Disney CEO Michael Eisner, and the rest of the Disney board. After leaving Disney on very hostile terms, he went on to found his own animation studio, DreamWorks. DreamWorks' first major motion picture was the 1998 computer animated movie Antz. The problem is that same year, Disney released Pixar's A Bug's Life. But that's just a crazy coincidence, right? Well, no, DreamWorks and Katzenberg didn't even try to pretend like it was. The original story started as a pitch for a 2D animated movie that Katzenberg heard in the early 1990s, back when he was leading Disney's animation division. The original idea shared little in common with either A Bug's Life or Antz when it comes to specifics, and it never came to fruition. But the concept of a kids' animated movie set in an ant colony stuck with Katzenberg. It also stuck with John Lasseter, a former animator with Disney who then became executive producer of all Pixar's early films, including A Bug's Life. Lasseter was extremely upset to hear that Katzenberg and DreamWorks were developing their own Ant movie while Pixar was working on what would become A Bug's Life, but neither studio backed down, nor did they change their release dates, and the two films ended up coming out within 6 weeks of each other. So clearly, part of the great bug movie craze of '98 lied in the fact that the leaders of the two prominent animation studios both worked at Disney at the same time, leading to one simple idea being planted in two men's minds, later germinating and then ultimately growing into two different plants, but both with, ants on them. Because ants, like flowers, that's not even true. It must be noted, though, that the plots of the films are distinct. A Bug's Life follows one ant colony who tries to utilize the help of other bugs to rise up against a gang of grasshoppers that forces the ants to collect their food under the threat of violent death. Ants is about a military coup? A class revolution? It's harder to nail down that movie's plot, but I'll get to those details later. I think it is reasonable to say that the two movies have similar themes, even if the actual plots are distinct. I don't think that this is necessarily evidence of DreamWorks stealing ideas or details from Pixar, though. An animated film that takes place in an ant colony really has no option but to include individuality versus conformity as a theme. I mean, it's an ant colony. There's hundreds of thousands to millions of ants in this community, and they all share 3 jobs. We gotta make our protagonists stand out, and we can't do that without addressing all the ways that they're just like everybody else, and how the character feels about that, and how they're different from everybody else because they don't actually like the status quo because they are the protagonist. These two films aren't even the only animated kids movie about bugs that have the same trope. Certainly, both films include individuality as a theme, and both ultimately praise the protagonist for the ways that they stray from the norm. But A Bug's Life takes the position of community being a strength, which is actually the central theme through the movie. Antz does include scenes stressing the power of numbers and the importance of working together, but it is also more outspoken about how the lack of individuality is dangerous. I would even say it's anti-collectivism. Now that's where things get tricky.
How can we be expected to teach children to learn how to read if they can't even fit inside the building?
As I mentioned before, the plot of Antz is convoluted, illogical, and honestly pretty ambitious. It centers around this one worker ant named Z, who is voiced by sexual predator and all-around annoying guy Woody Allen. Having to hear Woody Allen's voice in my children's animated movie in the year 2023 is, I think, a violation of my human rights. Who do I complain to about this? But anyway, this loser ant is sad because he's a nobody and he's bored with his day-to-day life. And he has a friend named Weaver who's a soldier ant, and they go to a bar and drink together and say some stuff that really made me question what was deemed appropriate for a kid's movie in 1998.
Call me crazy, but I have a thing about drinking from the anus of another creature, okay?
Suit yourself. Yeah, and ever since we were little, I've been listening to you complain. What are you bitching about?
And then the princess of the colony, Bala, arrives after having snuck out to go dancing, and she and Z hit it off, so of course Z is now in love. But the most important part of this scene is when Z and his soldier friend Weaver make a plan to switch jobs for a day, and somehow, despite some obvious dimorphism between the worker ants and those soldier ants, nobody suspects anything when this guy just shows up to join the army one day and this guy shows up to work at the mine. This plan, believe it or not, leads to some crazy hijinks. It turns out that the military general Mandible has decided to declare war on a nearby termite colony for political reasons. Like, this is part of his plan to depose the queen. We'll come back to this later. But Z ends up getting sent to war because he took Weaver's place in the army, and then he is the only soldier to survive the battle. Despite the all quiet on the Western Front style horror he witnesses, he is forced to smile and wave at the people as they hail him as a war hero upon his return. He's then brought to meet the queen and Princess Bala, but when Bala recognizes him, he takes her hostage and pretends like he's gonna kill her if they don't let him leave. But then in the process, they accidentally do fall down a chute and end up outside the colony together. Bala wants to return to the colony, but having never left it before, is too scared to escort herself back, and Z refuses to help, as he wants to look for the supposed urban center of the bug world called Insectopia that's rumored to be off in the distance, even though most in the colony don't believe it exists. The two eventually set off to find Insectopia together, although we don't get to this point without more uncomfortable dialogue.
You're the one who was cruising the worker bar looking for a little action, and you just happened to find it. The swarthy, earthy, sensual worker. You know, I was gonna let you become part of my most erotic fantasies.
You what?
Meanwhile, Z's act of defiance has inspired the other ants, mostly the workers, to also dream of standing up to the queen and Mandible and just generally disobey the oppressive hierarchical conditions they are forced to live under. This pisses off Mandible, as does the fact that Bala, who also happens to be his fiancée, is now missing. He sends Christopher Walken to go get her, while he comes up with the greatest plan of all time to get the other ants back in line. Mandible convinces all of the ants that Z really isn't any kind of hero to them, as he immediately abandoned his colony and went off on his own without giving a second thought to his people or their well-being. Which, yeah. He also rallies the ants around work again, convincing them that if they can just complete this new public works project, an underground megatunnel, that it would show their devotion to the colony and ultimately improve living standards for everyone, somehow.
And when we've completed this magnificent structure, we will reap the benefits. More food and less work for everyone.
And that's all well and fine and honestly seems to be pretty effective at controlling the masses, but that's not his actual plan. Mandible is actually tricking basically every single worker to complete work on a useless project before shoving them into an enclosed space for its grand opening, at which the ground will be broken on the last tunnel. This tunnel will open up to a puddle which will flood the space, drowning every single worker ant and the queen. And then Mandible's path to complete control of the colony will be finished.
And as further reward for your heroic efforts, each and every one of you will get the day off. So you can be the guest of honor at the Megatunnel dedication ceremonies.
That's his plan. Genius. Kill literally every single person who could possibly challenge your path to power, as in 90% of the population you aim to control, and then nobody will be left to challenge you. There will also be nobody left to expand your colony, keep your resources flowing, carry on your population, or just generally be your subjects, but immaterial details. When Christopher Walken expresses a hint of doubt, not at the logic of the plan, but more the humanity of it, Mandible inexplicably states that this is all for the good of the colony. So Mandible has this grand plan, but he also wants his fiancée back, so he sends Christopher Walken to go and find Bala and retrieve her. She is taken back against her will, which motivates Z to return to the colony after her. He gets back and manages to free Bala, but then they find out about Mandible's plan to trick the workers to dig straight into a puddle, killing everyone. Bala rushes to warn the queen, while Z tries to stop the workers, but the workers continue digging anyway, and soon the tunnels are flooded, with all exits being blocked. But with Z and Bala's guidance, all the Antz use their bodies to form a ladder that they can climb up to escape. On the surface, right above the tunnels where all the workers are supposed to be drowning, Mandible is ranting to all his soldiers about how he's going to make a new colony where only the strongest will survive. But then the workers bury through the ground surface, escaping the flood, and Christopher Walken goes to help, saying that this is for the good of the colony. Mandible is pissed and tries to attack him, but Z intervenes, and the two end up falling back into the flooded tunnel. Mandible dies, and Z nearly drowns, but then Christopher Walken saves him. Z is again praised as a hero by all of the Antz of the colony. He and Bala are now a couple in love, Z's self-actualization is complete, and all of the Antz are presumably going to build a better colony for all.
What do I owe you? Nothing. It's for free. Free!
So after hearing the entire plot of Antz, what do you think this movie's philosophy is? Because I don't think that I've made up my mind entirely. The most clear thing I can say about this movie is that it is interested in the concepts of individualism and collectivism and individuality and conformity, and it has a lot of ideas about those topics. Let's focus first on the simpler dichotomy here, individuality versus conformity. This theme comes up in the very first scene. Z is introduced speaking to a therapist about the ennui he feels as just one ant in a colony of several million where most everyone looks the same and has one of two jobs. In the bar scene where Z meets Bala, he encourages her to dance freely instead of the government-mandated choreography that everybody else knows. The movie at least articulates a statement here. Conformity is boring and people should have the freedom to express themselves, which is an anodyne take that I think almost every other movie for kids says or implies at some point. It's a harmless message, and for a movie set in an ant colony, it is actually relevant. Weirdly though, the next move that Z takes to try and break the status quo is to take Weaver's place in the army, which results in him getting sent to war and nearly dying a violent death. If we were to interpret just this series of events, it seems like the movie is punishing Z for stepping out of line, but this is also the trigger for most of the plot. Another way to interpret this is that if Weaver had gone to war, he probably wouldn't have survived, meaning that the rest of the movie, and most importantly the defeat of a military dictator and the evasion of genocide, never would have happened. Therefore, the colony needed a person like Z, who doesn't think like everybody else, to go to war, avoid death by essentially hiding the whole time, recognize how awful it is, and then trigger the rest of the story. I'm not sure that logically this holds up though, does Z going to war necessarily lead to the rest of the story? This entire plot feels more like a series of coincidences, where Z returning from war results in him running into Bala again, and her recognizing him as the worker ant from the bar the other night, and then him accidentally stumbling out of the anthill with her, but I'll chalk all that up to this just not being a very well written story. I think if this movie is trying to say anything about conformity with Z and Weaver's decision to switch places, it's probably trying to say that we should not just conform to the roles that society assigns us, which is also supported by Weaver's remarkable success as a worker ant, and this brief scene in which we see the queen seemingly arbitrarily assigning baby ants to the roles of either worker or soldier. There's also this moment where a dying soldier ant just tells Z to think for himself instead of mindlessly following orders. That's a pretty clear message. So, according to Antz, breaking free from society's arbitrary roles for us equals good. Thinking for yourself, from the way you dance to your attitude towards war, equals good. Okay, fine. Now, there is a big difference between individuality and individualism. Saying that people should embrace who they are outside of society's expectations is very different from saying that people do not have a moral or ethical obligation to support their society. And this could have been an interesting moral for this movie to communicate. The idea that we don't all need to conform to strict societally defined roles in order for us to serve our community, and in fact by appreciating everyone's unique strengths and differences, we are even stronger as a collective. That may have been the point of this movie at some point in time, but it is not what Antz ends up conveying. Instead, this movie is strictly against collectivism, while also utilizing some of its language.
It's the workers who control the means of production.
A simple definition of collectivism would be the prioritization of a group or a whole society over each of the individuals in it. In the modern world, there are entire cultures categorized as collectivist cultures, while most of the West, especially the United States, is called an individualist culture, essentially prioritizing individuals over the whole. This can manifest as privileging the liberties of citizens over the power of the government, cultural expectations to be more self-sacrificial, differences in attitudes when it comes to work, families, the economy, basically all aspects of a civilization. Whether these labels as they are applied in the real world are accurate is its own question, and I think you need to be very familiar with the intricacies of a culture to be able to answer it. But you'd expect the issue to be slightly simplified to work in an animated family movie. You'd expect them to say either that collectivist communities are oppressive, stifle individuality, and limit freedom, or that societies built on rugged individualism end up harming the people within them, especially the least powerful. You expect the movie to take a side and make some kind of statement. Antz does not. Let's look at what type of government we even have here at the start of the film. We have a hereditary monarchy along with a strong military and a pretty unambiguously collectivist mindset on the part of everyone there. The ants who supervise the work of the diggers and construction crew are unsympathetic to any of the complaints or excuses of the workers. They have quotas to meet, and nobody's going to rest until they meet them. The heavy focus on work for some ambiguous greater good at the expense of the individual's safety and freedom and, well, individuality is often associated with communism. So, is this society communist? Kind of. There doesn't seem to be any private property, and everyone is forced to work for the colony in one of a few select jobs that is most likely going to be chosen for you. The only reason I hesitate to just call it communist is because this is not an entire country, but one anthill. It's hard to imagine an ant colony that doesn't meet the definition of communism. Like, what would a free market even look like here? Saying that an anthill is communist is kind of like saying that one human household is communist because everyone lives together and shares everything and they all work for basically the same purpose. That's why I say this movie's not about communism. Like, on the surface, this society is seemingly communist, but the text of the film is more about the banal issue of nonconformity, even though the forces to which the characters are encouraged not to conform are the government and communism. So it's about rebellion in a communist society, but not because they are communist. Instead, it's because they're just a little, stifling. Oh yeah, and also because the military wants to mass murder everybody, but they don't know about that plan yet.
And the government are all Nazis.
The government are all Nazis!
Well, yeah, now, but not then.
But communism is a form of economic system, not government. It is theoretically possible to have a communist democracy or a neoliberal dictatorship. The government here appears to be controlled mostly by the military, with a monarch who is in part symbolic but does hold on to some power, presumably more than the general of the military, even if she mostly defers to his judgment. But as we know, General Mandible doesn't like this and makes moves to have the queen killed and assume total power. This would create a military junta with an economic system we cannot speak to because we never get to see it, and if Mandible had had his way, all of the workers would have been dead. But most likely it would have been an even stricter version of the anti-OSHA hellscape that they had before, with, I guess, some former soldiers taking on some more of the roles of the worker ants. Then what kind of society do we have at the end of the movie? Well, we still have the queen, but we also have some implicit promise of more democracy and greater emphasis on individual freedoms. Okay, so maybe we don't end up with the regulated capitalism and representative democracy of the US today, but this movie is essentially anti-communism and pro-individualism over collectivism. Well, no, that would be too simple. Just hearing the way that this plot progresses, you might think that this movie falls clearly on the individualism side of the individualism versus collectivism dichotomy, but there are actually a lot of nuances here that I have not yet gotten into. One aspect of the movie that I haven't gone into great detail about is the conflict between the regular ants of the colonies, mostly workers, and the military/monarchy leadership. You know, how after Z kidnaps the princess and escapes the colony, he is considered to be a hero by the worker ants for standing up to both the queen and the general, which motivates them to rebel more. The ants find strength in numbers, the workers band together, they even begin to strike. Essentially, what we have here is a class uprising. The working class ants are starting to question the leadership and deliberately slow down productivity, and believe that changing society's order is possible through collective action. But this is all motivated not by a sacrifice on the part of one ant for the greater good, but an act of individuality, a refusal to conform. The main reason they want to change society is because they don't want to continue living, working, and dying under the same regime that denies them basic rights and even the freedom to express themselves. Essentially, it's a class uprising fueled by individualism. Which is weird.
Studio president Jeffrey Katzenberg, petty asshole. So, Katzenberg, petty asshole. Jeffrey Katzenberg, petty asshole, finds his biggest post-Disney successes by sniping Disney ideas and being, well, an extremely petty asshole.
In my video on robots, I remarked how our innate fear of change tends to manifest in art, with writers nervous to effect radical change even in fictional worlds. Robots is a movie about how an evil billionaire seeks to genocide all poor and disabled people, in part by just making healthcare too expensive for them to afford. And the solution is not to make healthcare free, but to return to the status quo where life-saving care is still a for-profit business, and there are still plenty of poor robots with lifelong illnesses and disabilities that could easily be cured with modern technology, but won't be because that would require endorsing systemic change that would maybe imply a bit too much about our real world. Aside from some surface-level changes, the status quo must be preserved. And in Antz, well, we don't really have any significant change here. The Queen's still in power, all the workers survive, the army is still a thing. The only difference is that, like in Robots, the one malicious actor who loved power and wanted to kill all the normies had to go. What changed on a systemic level? Who will prevent someone like Mandible or Ratchet from rising again? At least Antz does end with the old colony being destroyed, meaning that it needs to be rebuilt. Maybe the new colony will be different. Maybe it will be more of a true democracy. Maybe the military will be slightly less OP. But we won't find out because this movie ends before we see any of that. This movie is about the defeat of evil and the prevention of radical change. And yes, the change Mandible was planning deserved to be prevented. It would have been terrible. But in its place, we have nothing but more of the same that Z was complaining about at the start of the movie. What, they can dance how they want now? Again, we don't know because that's not the story that the filmmakers opted to tell. I hope that one day we will get to see more movies about the kind of radical societal change that would actually make a difference in the world. You might think that animated movies made for families and kids would be a weird place for it, but I actually think it's a pretty sneaky way to translate radical messages to huge mainstream audiences. Because at the end of the day, you can always say that it's just allegory, or that the message was even unintentional. It's not about the United States healthcare system, it's about robots living in a robot world. It's not about the evils of classism, or dictatorships, or monarchies, or militarism, or whatever this movie was once supposed to be about. It's about ants.
I listened to it all and I said, Andrew, is this something I don't get? Is this about Queen Victoria? She's the main cat, and Disraeli and Gladstone are other cats, and then there are, poor cats, and am I missing this? And he took a terrible, painful, long pause and said, Hal, it's about cats. And we never discussed it again.
One of the notes I took in my phone while I was watching this movie just says, "What's so different about Z?" And in hindsight, I couldn't tell you what part of the movie prompted me to write this, but I still stand by it. What is so different about Z? Why do we have to watch a movie about him?